Hello Internet, welcome to the Eternal Spoiler Breakdown. My name is Pojo, and today we're going to be looking at another new mechanic for Eternal's third expansion, the Dusk Road. Today, Nightfall has been revealed, and I have to say it's actually more than I was expecting. I'm really happy to see that night as it is a mechanic that has some interesting gameplay prospects and gameplay elements to it. Night is indeed a sort of global condition that occurs on the battlefield whenever a unit with Nightfall is played. When you play a unit with Nightfall, it becomes night for the turn. On your opponent's turn, and then on your following turn, it continues to be night. And every time that your opponent or anyone else plays another Nightfall card, that extends the length of the night as far as it can go. So it's 2 turns every time that you are essentially playing the extra Nightfall card, and yeah, you'll get 2 turns of Nightfall as a result. Now, what is Night? Well, we already know that Night is a condition that triggers certain abilities on cards. So if you have for example, this new card here, Rindra, has Lifesteal and Overwhelm only when it is night. Now, the thing about Night that is interesting is that, unique of any cards, it actually has a specific effect, which is the effect from the Eclipse event of Eternal. So if you aren't familiar with that effect, it is every single turn on your draw step, you will take 1 point of damage and you will draw an extra card. So if you play a card with Nightfall, on your opponent's turn, they take 1 point of damage and they draw an extra card. On your turn, you take a point of damage and you draw an extra card. And then it continues to be night if other Nightfall cards are played, otherwise night will end on your turn. So yeah, really interesting, really useful, sort of cool mechanic. And the thing about it is that if night decks become very popular in the meta, events become a lot more similar to the Eclipse deck, where you are drawing 2 cards a turn, and essentially there's a sort of like Howling Mine style effect, if you're familiar with Magic. But in general, just extra draws for everyone is the prevailing idea behind Nightfall. This is definitely a game changer. This really changes the landscape of how it is that you want to build your decks in a very serious way. Every deck that you build, while you are going to be kind of happy with having some mid-range elements to them or some control elements to them, you have to have ways to essentially burn cards and use cards for advantage at very low costs, because if you are seeing a lot of Nightfall in the meta, if Nightfall becomes a powerful mechanic, then you are going to see a lot of extra draws, regardless of whether you are a Nightfall deck or not. That's really interesting from a gameplay perspective. It really increases the value of certain cards that would otherwise not be as good. Black Iron Manacles is certainly one of them. There are lots of interesting options where you can sort of punish people for drawing cards. I wouldn't say that those are hugely important, but it's notable to say that a lot of different cards are increasing in value, including fairly low power, low cost cards like Trail Stories, weird life gain cards, Water of Life, or Lumen Defender, and other things like that. Anything that gains you life is actually really helpful here, because not only are those cards typically fairly cheap to play, but they also allow you to last out the night a little bit longer, and it means that the damage that you're taking from drawing cards will actually become very relevant, because you're not getting pressured down by the Nightfall. And that's something to consider. None of those cards, I would say, are going to become suddenly top tier as a result of that, but they are going to go up in value in your decks, and they are going to be things that you're more likely to consider. I think that Nightfall Life Force might definitely be a thing. It should be a really interesting deck, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, because there are a couple of cards here that specifically support that kind of idea, including Rindra herself, the Lifesteal Overwhelm at Night unit. Okay, so regardless of whether or not you are playing a lot of Nightfall cards or a few Nightfall cards, you can evaluate Nightfall cards based on what they do individually. And sometimes you're going to want to run just one Nightfall card and be okay with it becoming night. So, for example, Rindra is a 5/5 for 4. She's super efficient, and if you're playing her in a Feln aggro type deck, Midnight Gale also has the same influence cost and is a very efficient flyer. So, like, there's a good reason to play a card like Rindra in just straight Feln aggro without any Nightfall. Now, because she has Lifesteal and Overwhelm at night, her first attack she will guaranteed have Lifesteal and Overwhelm. And when she is played, she also has Lifesteal for her defensive turn. So the turn that you play her, she's a lot better. And she also gives both players an extra draw and deals an extra damage to those players, which generally helps the more aggressive deck if you're trying to do a lot of pressure, but also gives control decks a lot more options and makes it easier for them to get to key sweepers like Harsh Rule or Lightning Storm or any of those cards. I think that sweepers are going to be absolutely crucial in terms of Nightfall cards. Like, if you are playing a control style deck, you can take advantage of that extra cards. You're not going to get completely flooded out, but you really need sweepers to deal with the early aggro rushes, because those rushes are going to get all of their coffers refilled by night, and you need to be able to basically just clear the board, get things back to a reset, and then eventually start getting into the late game where the fact that you are drawing a bunch of extra cards really, really helps you, because you're getting consistent power drops, you're getting lots and lots of options, and you're getting like all of your cool control stuff. So big sweepers are going to be important, just like more like interesting things that are going to happen as a result of Nightfall. Okay, so Rindra, Lifesteal and Overwhelm at night, a 5/5 unit. This is a beater. This is a very spiky card. She deals 1 damage to each player because she automatically triggers Knights, so that much at least happens. Nightfall damage, by the way, does not pop Aegises. It simply goes straight through them, and it cannot be blocked in any fashion, so you will take damage from Nightfall no matter what, and that's something that's actually important to note. But yeah, a 5/5 unit in hybrid with Lifesteal and Overwhelm is extremely powerful. If you can keep it being Night, she maintains a really consistent power level, but she's still got the stats of an Impending Doom, and she's quite solid in that respect. I think there's a really easy Feln tempo to mid-range deck that's going to be very, very happy to run Rindra, as well as Midnight Gale, Impending Doom, all of the sort of big beater units, and regardless, she seems like she's powerful enough that she's going to fit in quite a few decks. The one thing about a 4-cost 5/5 is that it does not, of course, match up against Sandstorm Titan, but in Shadow you have more answers to Sandstorm Titan than any other color. You're very likely to be running Annihilates and Feeding Times and Death Strikes and all sorts of different options to get rid of that card, so I don't think you're going to be too bothered by it, and regardless, she's big enough to handle almost any other threat, so that's really relevant. She's a really, really big card. She's a little bit slow on the ground because she can be blocked by the 6/6s later, so big mid-range is not really her favorite thing, but she triggers Nightfall, she activates cool Nightfall decks, and she's gonna probably have a pretty good time. I think this card's just a spiky delight, and I'm very, very happy to see her. Okay, so we have 5 cards spoiled, all of them with Nightfall. We're going to go through each of them in turn. The next one's really interesting. You'll notice that Rindra is an unseen, the sort of Huru order of ninjas. The Huru now have some unseen Feln cards, which is fairly important to note. We're going to go ahead and move into Dark Veil Agent and talk a little bit about that as well. Dark Veil Agent is a 2/2 with Summon Nightfall, so it's one of the earliest activators for Nightfall, and I don't know if we're going to see 1 or 0 drops that activate Nightfall, but I expect that there will be some, and they might be somewhat underpowered. So this card is probably going to be fairly efficient as far as Nightfall goes. I don't know for sure about the design, but that's my guess. In any case, Dark Veil Agent has summoned Nightfall, and whenever you start your turn at night, your Unseen get Aegis. So the card has no immediate board impact for a 2-drop, which is something to worry about in certain aspects. But if you are playing an Unseen aggro deck with a lot of Feln cards in it, or a lot of Feln and Huru, then the Aegis that this card grants is really, really relevant. And it isn't always easy to just get rid of a 2-drop on command. Now, if you don't get rid of Dark Veil Agent the turn that Dark Veil Agent is played, it will almost assuredly give itself Aegis and then be very, very hard to kill for the rest of the game, along with all of your other Unseen. So that gets pretty relevant pretty fast if you're using it to protect a lot of your Nightfall cards and a lot of your other, like, pretty important ninjas. Basically, this card demands an answer from your opponent early, which means that you can often get efficient trades for removal. That's something that you actually really want to be doing. And then also, it basically just makes it so that removal is much worse late. This card can get a lot of value, especially since it completely disables sweepers, and if sweepers are your primary answer to the sort of aggro style, then you have to get rid of Darkveil Agent before you can sweep up anything else. Meaning that the 3 and 4 drops that you're going to be playing are going to be more well positioned to take advantage of basically like your opponent, because you basically just have to focus down on Darkveil Agent if you want to throw a harsh rule on turn 5. So yeah, Darkveil Agent seems like a really solid aggro card. It's got good tempo to it. It doesn't have any innate abilities, and that's a little bit worrying, but because it is a vanilla unit that also triggers Nightfall, it seems like it's perfectly positioned for an aggressive Nightfall deck. And aggressive Nightfall will definitely be a pretty cool deck that gets to draw a bunch of units and consistently play threats and have a little bit of a late game presence, which will be kind of cool to see. The main thing about Nightfall cards is that if you're playing aggro Nightfall, you will see some fall off just because your opponent is going to be drawing so many cards that can just trade with these things. If you can't get the damage across, they're going to be so flush with cards that it's actually going to be harder to deal with. I don't know if drawing 2 cards a turn is necessarily going to favor aggro as much as people are going to expect, but I think it will generally be very good for the Nightfall style of aggro deck, and that will be really interesting to watch. Okay, so Darkveil Agent and the Rindra the Duskblade are pretty exciting. We have one more unit in the shadow colors, one more unseen, in fact, and that is Mirus Nightshade, who is a 3/2 that gets +1/+1 whenever an enemy is cursed. Now, there aren't that many early ways to curse an opponent, but there are quite a few in unseen colors. Azindel's Gift is one of them. The other option, I believe, at the moment is Vision of Austerity, which will curse the player because it transforms relics. So if you can actually throw a Vision of Austerity on your opponent, then that's one way to activate Mirus Nightshade. But of course she has a way to self-activate, which is that if you pay 5, you can play Nyctophobia on the enemy player. And if you did not know, Nyctophobia does of course mean Fear of Darkness. Summon Nightfall. Night deals +1 damage to the cursed player. Now, we mentioned earlier that Night does in fact ping you every turn before you draw, so this one increases the amount of damage that Night is dealing to you. Overall, this curse is very low impact, so the reasons that you're going to want to be playing it are A, for the +1/+1, B, for the slight bit of extra damage, and C, for the extra Nightfall trigger, because that's going to mean that you're going to allow your units to be in Night a lot longer than you would normally otherwise be able to. And that does provide you with some form of card advantage. So pretty relevant. I think that overall Nyctophobia, which can stack on your opponent, you can play as many of these as you can actually activate. So there are a lot of ways that you could just build up Nightfall triggers on your opponent and force them to take tons of damage every upkeep. But I think that most of the time Nyctophobia will just resolve 2 or 3 damage, and that'll be enough to push it over the edge or to determine whether or not the game is going to be won or lost. So it isn't going to be the most efficient card, but it's a really good way to just sink your power and get a lasting effect that actually really is quite meaningful if a deck does not have a lot of action to it. Alright, so let's go back to Mirus, and we'll talk about her specifically. So a 3/2 for 2 is reasonably efficient stats. That's about the baseline standard for an aggressive card. Those cards don't typically fare that well because they do trade with other 2/2s, trade with 1/2s as well, or 2/1s rather. And yeah, like that means that they're not amazing at being aggressive. But if you can curse your opponent very quickly, then a 4/3 for 2 is really, really efficient. So there's a lot of ways in which if you are actually benefiting off of cool curses, in particular I think the interesting one is Black Iron Manacles, you can definitely have some fun with that. Now Mirus does not herself trigger Nightfall, so she won't have any sort of night advantages, and you're going to be needing to play other Nightfall triggers to actually get her out, or you're going to basically expect your opponent to be playing Nightfall triggers and kind of punishing them for that. I think that overall she looks like a reasonably solid card for her stat line. The +1/+1 is a little bit hard to get. Everything about her extra stats is a little bit awkward, but we're okay with that because her basic stat line is just fine. She's going to trade with something evenly, and if she doesn't trade with something evenly, then she's going to trade better than evenly, because she either gets you a Nyctophobia, or benefits off of a curse and trades 2 for 1, or just deals a little bit of damage and basically gets what you want out of a 2-drop. So reasonable development, pretty good card. I'm not sure if it's going to be an absolute aggro staple, but I think it's doing enough in enough different places that it should be able to fill a lot of gaps in your decks and really help out the sort of unseen aggro archetype, which there are now enough cards to definitely run with Mirus and Rindra and the new unseen, what is his name again? Darkveil Agent. Yeah, so very interesting stuff. There's a slightly weaker Nightfall card here that is probably a draft common, fairly good for essentially doing what you want in terms of just getting a little bit of damage across, forcing that sort of final bit of damage that you need to kill your opponent, or getting some cool infiltrates. This is Cover of Darkness, a Nightfall spell that gives 2 of your units unblockable this turn. I don't expect this to see play in ranked, it's too expensive. The unblockable ability is very, very good, but overall there's just so many different ways to get infiltrate units across and to get particular types of lethal across. We talked a little bit about Jump Kick and how it wouldn't be a very good card. I think it's a better card in a Nightfall meta, specifically because being aggressive and spending a lot of small cards very quickly to achieve some sort of damage are both things that Nightfall decks are really going to want to do, or decks that take advantage of Night are really going to want to do. So that card's raised a little bit in my estimation. It's still not an amazing card, but I think that it's definitely better than, say, Cover of Darkness here. So yeah, Cover of Darkness, give 2 of your units unblockable this turn. That's really, really good as far as just pushing across the last bit of damage that you need. If you can get 2 big creatures across in draft, that can be as much as 10 to 12 damage. There's often a lot of stuff that you're just kind of sitting behind, like really wishing that you could push across. It's not as common in shadow decks, but it's fairly likely that this card will get you a reasonable way to end a draft and win a game. So it'll be a good pickup, typically fairly late in the pack, and I think that if you don't have a way to win the game, this is a solid way to do it. The Nightfall helps as well, because it not only just gives both players an extra draw and deals a little bit of extra damage, it really just sort of enforces that bit of, it basically allows you to play with other Nightfall cards and gives you some common triggers for it in draft, which I'm guessing you're going to need because there's going to be probably a lot of Nightfall cards. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. I'd say overall it's a cool draft common. It's not going to see a ton of play, but it should be a good late pick, and yeah, you pick it up the same reason that you pick up Cloud of Ash or something along those lines. There's a 5-cost card with Warp that exhausts 2 units. This is significantly better than that, but overall it's on a similar power level. You definitely want that sort of later in the set. Alright, we have one last card, and that is our first time Nightfall card. Nightfall was not specifically Feln, and that's important to note because I do think that this is going to be a 5-color ability. Now, we know that the Eternal set is named the Dusk Road, and that, of course, we have this sort of theme of the encroaching Shadowlands. The Shadowlands are starting to take over, and people are, not particularly sure what to do. I think this is really flavorfully represented in Nightfall, because what you essentially have is a mechanic where people are causing night to fall, and they're just, because they're, grasping for power, they are increasing the amount of time that the night lasts. That's really good flavor. That's just mechanically sound and interesting. And as a result, it's a kind of mechanic that you're going to see in 5 different colors. It's something that is pervasive throughout the set, and it's going to be a defining feature of the set. So we're going to see a lot of cards with basically all sorts of different abilities, but the 3 main ones, Ally and Nightfall and potentially Bond, should all be 5-color abilities. Not 100% sure on that, but we've already seen 3 colors represented, and I think that it seems fairly likely that we'll see the other 2 represented as well. Okay, so this is Lunar Magus, a 2/4 for 3 with double time influence. That double time influence is a killer, folks, but it isn't that hard to hit, and overall you shouldn't have too much of a problem getting Lunar Magus out. So Lunar Magus has Summon Nightfall. He is a 2/4. That's a pretty dang good stat line. Like, overall, it's not amazing for 3, but it does mean that you have a good defensive stat line, and it gives you something against specifically the horde of unseen 2/2s and 3/2s that we've just seen. So aggressive Nightfall decks are going to have to deal with Lunar Magus. Lunar Magus has Summon Nightfall, so he does trigger Nightfall for you, giving both players card draw, but he also has, when you start your turn at night, you gain 4 health. So, unless you can kill Lunar Magus the turn that he is out, he's going to gain you health equivalent to almost a Lumen Defender. A 3-cost 2/4 that gains you 4, if that were a summon effect, this card would be absolutely bonkers. It would simply just stymie all aggro decks. As it is, this card is a really obnoxious obstacle that your opponent has to deal with before they can attack you effectively. So if you can play this on a turn when they are not able to play some sort of removal card, not only will this continue to gain you life through every single one of your opponent's Nightfalls and your Nightfalls, but it's also going to mean that you basically are outlasting those aggro decks in a really, really solid way. This is a good Life Force trigger. I think Life Force Nightfall has a lot of legs with a card like this. The immediate impact of it is so low that you have to be careful with it, but I think that overall this should be powerful enough in ranked. It dodges Torch, it requires removal along the lines of Annihilate or Suffocate, both of which are well, not Suffocate usually, but cards like Annihilate or Death Strike or Feeding Time, oftentimes this card will get removal that is intended for your Sandstorm Titans, and if you can throw a Sandstorm Titan down next, then that's not bad at all. So it is a big enough blockade for an aggro deck at 3 that it's going to be quite problematic. See Combre Healer, for example. Yeah, this is a good card overall. Like, the extra life gain is going to be very relevant. This should sort of help control decks establish some value. As I said, I do believe that life gain is going to be really, really important in Nightfall, because all of that incidental damage from all of the repeated nights is going to add up. And if you want to take advantage of your card advantage later in the game, you're going to have some forms of life gain in order to make sure that you're healthy and hale and can continue to make decisions from a position of power. So if you want to play control decks, some life gain will definitely help in these situations. Lunar Magus is not a bad place to start. Yeah, so that is the 5 cards that we have seen. This is looking like a really exciting set. I am just really delighted with how Nightfall turned out. I did expect it to be some sort of summon effect that extended things, but I just think that that extra bit where it actually creates like a really interesting environment where people are taking a lot of extra damage and drawing a lot of extra cards should promote really full of action games with a lot of interesting back and forth and a lot of like new cards being used. There's going to be a lot of stuff that's better in a Nightfall meta that just wouldn't be otherwise in Eternal, and that's pretty exciting. We're going to be looking back to set 1, we're going to be looking back to set 2, and we're going to be trying to find new things to do when it's night and everyone can draw a billion cards. I am most excited for, wow, man, there's just a ton of cool decks, but it looks like in particular Curiox decks and Caldera and Cradle decks are going to be having a pretty fun time, because the one thing that they generally lack is enough draw engines to play the cards that they want to activate Cradles and to get enough spells for Curiox's Eye, that new 3-color Curiox. So just drawing a bunch of extra cards every turn means that that could be a much more reliable deck, and every time that it faces off against a Nightfall deck, it's going to have a much better time. So yeah, just interesting stuff. Overall, this is a big flavor win. This is a big mechanical win. I think that it just looks really, really exciting. There are ways that the balance could be wrong on this, and this is certainly a dangerous mechanic. This could totally mess things up, and obviously if it hasn't been tested well enough, we will find out pretty quickly, because it could be like a hot mess. But I think that it's there. The cards look right. The numbers look right on them. I don't think this is going to completely crack things open. I think it's going to be similar to the Eclipse about 50% of the time, and just trying to design decks around that concept should be a ton of fun. So I'm really excited to see how that goes. Eternal's been knocking it out of the park on balance lately. I think that they've done a really good job, and I think that this is just an exciting mechanic to lead with on your third huge set, and I'm excited. So on that note, we will see you guys next time. There have been spoilers almost every day. I'm trying to get a new brew out, but we'll definitely keep covering them as they come out. So feel free to like or subscribe if you liked this video. We'll be back with more spoiler breakdowns and some regular Eternal videos too, I swear. See you guys very soon. Have a really good night. And yeah, cheers.